You ever been there when an uncomfortable question about race comes up, but you don't know how to answer? That's where Code Switch lives. Each week, we're talking about race and how it intersects with every other aspect of your life, from politics and pop culture to history and food. Listen now to the Code Switch podcast from NPR.
It was Democrat versus Democrat in the technically nonpartisan Houston mayoral runoff. Which one won and what do we make of it? Today on the Texas Standard.
Texas Standard is a production of KUT Austin, KERA North Texas, Houston Public Media, and Texas Public Radio in San Antonio.
I'm Laura Rice. The borderlines of two South American countries have long been in dispute. How a recent reignition of the argument may have just as much to do with politics as it does with oil. School districts across Texas have been hoping for an increase in funding, while even some with large tax bases are struggling to make ends meet. When you think of climate activists, who comes to mind? Now, it may surprise you which age group says it's become a top issue for them. And we're talking food unique to Texas, not barbecue or Tex-Mex, but South Indian Texas cuisine. That and more just ahead on today's Texas Standard. From the plains to the piney woods and all places in between, it's the Texas Standard for Monday, December 11th. I'm Laura Rice. Our focus today at the top of this program is on two areas known for their relationship with oil, though in Texas, no doubt, one is more familiar to most than the other. The unfamiliar one is to our south, in South America, in fact, but in which country exactly is at the center of the dispute? Long within the borders of Guyana, a country that's not often in the headlines, but long disputed over with neighboring Venezuela. More on why that issue is gaining international attention in just a few minutes. But first, to the undisputed oil and gas capital of Texas, Houston, where State Senator John Whitmire has defeated Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee to win election as the 63rd mayor of Houston. The tally from the Harris County Clerk's Office showed Whitmire beating Jackson Lee 65% to 34%, and Whitmire led consistently in most polling ever since his first public announcement that he planned to run for mayor more than 2 years ago. Here to tell us more is Patrick Svitek, who covers politics at the Texas Tribune. Patrick, welcome back to the Texas Standard.
Thank you for having me.
So what factors worked in Whitmire's favor here in winning this race?
Whitmire was long seen as the favorite in this race. He made clear as far back as late 2021 that he was interested in running for this job. He brought a huge war chest to the race from his time in the state Senate, being able to save up millions of dollars as a state senator in his campaign account. And as you pointed out, he led in every public poll throughout this race, both before the initial election and then during the runoff. So the outcome on Saturday night was not necessarily surprising. I think what may have surprised some people was just the size of Whitmire's margin of victory being nearly 30 percentage points.
So what were the candidates talking about during this campaign, and did they differ on the issues?
Both of these candidates really spoke about bread and butter municipal issues, keeping people safe, public safety, fixing the roads, infrastructure, issues like flood mitigation, which are especially important in cities like Houston. And so the issue set between the two candidates was not that different, but there were some stylistic differences we saw in terms of the points of emphasis from either candidate and how they said they would achieve their goals. So, for example, John Whitmire spoke a lot more about wanting to restore trust and restore the relationship between Houston and Austin. Obviously, the state and the city have had some intense political battles over the years, and so he spoke about, given his experience as a state lawmaker, wanting to get into City Hall and kind of create a more constructive relationship with the state legislature again. So that was one thing he emphasized. Sheila Jackson Lee, she put herself forward as more of a reliable Democrat, I would say. And you could just see that in the endorsements that she touted from big Democratic stars like Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton. She was clearly trying to send the message to the voters that there are two Democrats in this race, but I'm the more reliable Democrat, the one that you can trust. And I think that was apparent both in her endorsements and some of her campaign rhetoric.
Do we make anything of that as far as like a broader lesson to be learned from this election, that Whitmire was perhaps the more moderate candidate here, and that Houstonites were drawn to that? Or is this just a single scenario where two candidates were at play and Houstonites cast votes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think on some issues, Whitmire was maybe more moderate than Sheila Jackson Lee, but honestly, I don't think that's the story of the race here, is that there was some huge ideological contrast between a moderate Democrat and a progressive Democrat. I think the outcome is just largely due to Whitmire's strength as a candidate. That the fact that he was able to have so much money go into this race, the fact that he has served for so long in Houston, the fact that polls showed regularly that voters liked him more than Sheila Jackson Lee, and he honestly did not have any campaign gaffes. While Sheila Jackson Lee had a few here and there that I think made some folks cringe. So I really do think there may not be some broader ideological story here as much as it's just a story about the strength of the Whitmire candidacy.
Well, what happens now? You ended your story talking about statements from Whitmire about opening the doors to City Hall and shaking hands with you and your friends and your neighbors. Is that the type of mayor that we expect him to be, very hands-on?
We will see. I mean, this is something that he's fought hard for over the past several months, something that, as I noted earlier, he has been on the record wanting to do for quite a long time. It's been an ambition of his to come home and run for mayor and lead the city. And so I assume he has all kinds of ideas that he's eager to start implementing. And of course, as I noted earlier, he wants to build a better relationship with the state. And so we'll start seeing, it'll be interesting to see if there's any overtures from him to try to reset that relationship, which has become fraught in recent years.
Patrick Svitek covers politics at the Texas Tribune. Patrick, thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
A long-standing territory dispute between two neighboring South American countries reignited over the weekend, with the Venezuelan government moving to claim more than half of Guyana's territory as its own. An international tribunal ruled that the oil-rich Essequibo region belonged to Guyana more than a century ago, but Venezuela has consistently contested that decision. Last week, a nationwide referendum saw Venezuelans voting to reclaim the Essequibo territory. Now Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro is capitalizing on the issue to drum up support in the lead up to his country's upcoming presidential election. Kurt Wayland is professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where he specializes in democratization and authoritarian rule in Latin America. Professor Wayland, welcome.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So what role does the discovery of oil in the Essequibo region play in this dispute?
This was the specific trigger that inflamed the situation because large oil deposits were discovered off the coast of Guyana in front of this Essequibo region. And so the long-standing dispute was inflamed for that reason because resources are at hand. Maduro has ruined the Venezuelan oil industry, wouldn't mind having more oil deposits. And so, as you mentioned, in the run-up of the current election, he's using this nationalist issue as a diversionary tactic to wrong-foot the opposition and improve his chances in the presidential election, given that he has had a terrible performance and has essentially ruined his country's economy. He wants to draw attention away from that by inflaming nationalism.
So is he using this as a distraction for Venezuelans or across the country, or maybe as an excuse to delay an election if perhaps the conflict escalated, or is it yet to be seen?
I haven't heard the idea that he would want to delay the election. What is more likely the case is that he will want to whip up nationalist support. He will want to wrong-foot the opposition, because when you're in opposition and there's a nationalist issue at hand, you cannot easily disagree with the government. So you have to fall in line behind the government. Yes, we all want Essequibo. Then what opposition are you? And the specific trigger is the following. The Venezuelan opposition facing this brutal dictatorship has for a long time been divided and not posed a very credible challenge. But an opposition leader has emerged, Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition primary with 92% of the opposition vote. And so I think that is the specific context, that he will be compelled to hold the election under international scrutiny, but he wants to manipulate things as much as possible. I mean, they had even, at this point, Machado, the opposition leader, is still officially disqualified because the government uses all kinds of tricks to hinder opposition campaigning. Mm-hmm. But there's international pressure for her to be qualified to run. And then Maduro is in a very difficult position. And so that is essentially why he's using this diversionary tactic.
Well, I know this is such a complicated issue, but quickly, if we can, I know the U.S. has come out in support of Guyana. What is the reaction from the international community been thus far?
The international community is concerned because first, they don't want to have a war. There would be the third war after Ukraine and after Gaza, and that is why one reason why Maduro thinks he can do a little bit of saber rattling. The international community clearly wants to forestall another armed conflict. A country that is very concerned about this is, of course, Brazil, because Brazil has long seen itself as the rising leader of South America with certain hegemonic aspirations. But Lula da Silva, the recently re-elected president, does not want that conflict to escalate in a way that would really draw in the United States as protector of Guyana. And that is why Brazil is especially worried about this whole conflict.
Kurt Wayland is professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Wayland, thanks again.
Yes, good. Thank you.
Wells Dunbar, as always, is watching the Talk of Texas for us. Hey, Wells.
Hi, Laura. Good to be with you. Well, we're hearing reactions about a state story making national and even international headlines. That story being the Texas Supreme Court temporarily halting a ruling allowing a Dallas woman to receive an abortion. This, of course, in contradiction of the state's anti-abortion laws. Her making the plea after her fetus was diagnosed with lethal abnormalities. Well, on her Facebook page, Dinah Miller laments the fear, grief, and panic a Texas family is enduring while being denied health care for a non-viable pregnancy. How the Texas government grew so powerful as to control private medical decisions and overrule a judge and physicians threatening a family. I can't imagine what they are going through, Dinah says. I fear for my adult daughter and hope she considers safer places to live. Meanwhile, Karen Neuenschwander laments the cruelty of Paxton and the Texas GOP forcing women to beg for permission to end doomed pregnancies. She asks, I wonder, what level of authoritarianism is it going to take to motivate people to actually vote them out? A call to action there from one of our listeners opposed to that decision from the Texas Supreme Court, in agreement with the Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who filed to block that order from a judge in Travis County allowing the procedure to take place. It's one story we're watching, and we're watching plenty more too, Laura. I'll be back with more reactions and perspectives from social media later in the program.
That's right. These court decisions can sometimes go back and forth, and of course we will keep on top of it. Wells Dunbar is also watching what you have to say online. You can find us on social media or go to our website, texasstandard.org.
Support for Texas Standard comes from the Texas Tuition Promise Fund. For over 10 years, helping families lock in current tuition rates and required fees at Texas public colleges and universities, excluding medical and dental institutions. TexasTuitionPromiseFund.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. The 13 constitutional amendments Texas voters approved last month will be implemented, despite a handful of lawsuits filed by far-right activists challenging the election. The Texas Newsroom's Sergio Martinez Beltran reports that means property tax cuts and raises for retired teachers will not be tied up in court.
A handful of lawsuits filed by election conspiracy theorists were preventing Governor Greg Abbott from certifying the election results. The lawsuits revolved around false claims the state's voting machines were connected to the internet. Last week, the Texas Senate rushed a bill that would have expedited the trials of any lawsuits challenging a constitutional amendment election, but it stalled in the Texas House, leaving many wondering what would happen next. But on Thursday, Governor Abbott's office confirmed to the Texas Newsroom that the will of the voters prevailed. The amendments will go into effect without delay. These include property tax cuts and retired teacher salary raises, plus funding for state parks and water infrastructure. I'm Sergio Martinez Beltran in Austin.
Support for coverage of business comes from Texas Mutual Insurance Company, a workers' comp provider committed to protecting Texas employers by investigating fraud and focusing on preventing abuse of the system. More at texasmutual.com/fraud.
And you're listening to the Texas Standard. Pretty much everything costs more than it did in 2019, but in Texas, the state's public schools are still getting the same amount of money they were then. Bills that would have increased funding have been held up by Governor Abbott, who says his first priority is passing a school voucher-like program. Meanwhile, school districts are struggling to balance their budgets, even districts with a lot of property wealth. Texas Public Radio's Camille Phillips says you just have to look at Austin to understand why.
It's no secret that it costs a pretty penny to live in the state's capital city. Rent's gotten so high that some are being priced out. So even though they couldn't really afford it this year, Austin ISD gave its employees a raise.
We knew that we needed to do something with regards to doing our best to pay our employees a livable wage.
Eduardo Ramos is the district's chief financial officer. He says that salary bump pushed Austin ISD into a $52 million deficit. That's despite the fact the district collects more in property tax revenue than almost any other in the state. So why does Austin ISD have a deficit? Well, it doesn't get to keep all that money. In Texas, anything above an amount set by the state legislature gets redistributed to property-poor districts. The system's called recapture. Most people know it as Robin Hood. Ramos says there is a need to share property wealth, but he thinks the current system benefits the state more than schools.
I feel that recapture districts have become a revenue source for the state of Texas. So when the state receives recapture payments above what they budgeted, they reduce their share, and so they use those funds for other state needs.
He says for recapture to work the way it should, the state needs to invest more in public schools. Austin ISD had about $10,500 per student last year, $2,000 less than the average Texas school district.
When you have a district like Austin ISD that's over 50% economically disadvantaged and sending over half of our local tax collections back to the state, to us, that's an unfair system.
If he were in control of the state funding formula, Ramos would tie per-student dollars to inflation with automatic increases. He says Austin ISD needs $900 more per student just to keep up with inflation. He'd also create an allotment for districts like his, where the cost of living is higher.
One of the misconceptions I think that's out there is that when you're a property wealthy district, there's personal wealth in your district as well. And so Austin ISD, that's not the case.
Just over half of Austin ISD's 73,000 students are economically disadvantaged. But in some schools, like Webb Middle School on Austin's northeast side, almost every student comes from low-income families. Nearly 90% are Latino.
Okay, so that's the part that we need to make sure that the trumpets don't do. We go low, high, low, they just stay on low.
Principal Michael Coyle says electives like this first-year band class are important because they spark students' interest.
Okay, all right, baritone, trombone, tuba, here we go. Starting on this F, last two measures.
But he has to fundraise to be able to send students to competitions.
1, 2, ready, go.
Electives are sometimes the first things that sometimes get cut, and it's a shame when we have to choose between a math teacher and a choir teacher.
Coyle pulls out a huge key ring he uses on the tour.
We also have 1 million keys.
Webb Middle School is an older building and doesn't have fancy new security upgrades like key cards.
Overall building updates and those security systems would be huge for our students. So walking in here, they know, I hope they feel safe already, but just that extra level of support that unfortunately costs money.
2 rows of trailers on one side of the school house classes for recent immigrants. 3 out of 4 students at Webb are English language learners. Inside an ELL social studies class, the teacher guides students through a lesson on the banking system. He brushes his palms together to symbolize making money rain.
What is something that we give money to?
Oh, like money.
The bank, how do you say bank in Spanish?
Banco.
In French?
Banco.
Overall, Coyle says a lot of his students have higher levels of need, both to catch up in the classroom.
Some of our students from other countries may not have been in school for years.
And more fundamental things.
It's so important that we have, money for those kinds of things that help our students with basic needs, because they can't concentrate in a classroom when they don't have food, they don't have running water, they don't have electricity.
Texas, like a lot of states, gives extra funding to students who need more support. Low-income students get about 25% more. Most English language learners get 10%. Coyle says that's not enough for Webb, and researchers say those students should be getting at least double. Erica Wiggins-Weathers researches education funding policies at the University of Pennsylvania. She says poverty often ends up being used as a proxy for race. But her work shows Black and Latino students often end up with less funding than white students, even if they're equally poor.
And why is that? What is it about racialized poverty that means they're getting less? And I don't think we have enough conversation about that.
A big part of the reason is because states rely on property tax to pay for education. Historic discriminatory housing policies linger today in school district boundaries and property values. Austin ISD is expected to collect more than $1 billion in property taxes again this year. But because Austin also has a lot of students with a lot of needs, the district, like many Texas school districts, will most likely struggle to make ends meet again next year. Webb Middle School principal Michael Coyle says he knows district leaders would give his school more money if they had it, but their hands are tied by the Texas school finance system.
It's hard to see, like schools, state-of-the-art schools in other areas that are using money, that come from our city that aren't being used for our students who need it most.
Without an exception to recapture called golden pennies, Austin would have an even harder time making ends meet. Golden pennies allow Austin ISD to keep about $1,000 more in property taxes per student. But the districts truly benefiting from golden pennies have a lot of land worth a lot of money and very few students. In part 4 of our series, we'll visit a West Texas district that has nearly 5 times as much money to spend per student than Austin ISD. I'm Camille Phillips in Austin.
This is the third story in a series from our partners at Texas Public Radio. They're calling it Golden Pennies, Why Texas School Funding Still Isn't Fair. Listen for the next story later this week or go to tpr.org/goldenpennies for more right now.
Support for Texas Standard comes from TCU, striving to address the world's challenges through research, scholarship, and service for 150 years. More at 150.tcu.edu.
From the Texas Newsroom, I'm Matt Thomas. The deadline for filing for next year's election is today. The highest profile race is in the U.S. Senate, where multiple challengers are lining up to take on Ted Cruz, including U.S. Representative Colin Allred and State Senator Roland Gutierrez. Meanwhile, Texas continues to rank as one of the most difficult states to vote in. But as TPR's David Martin Davies reports, it's no longer at the very bottom of the list.
Of the 50 states, Texas comes in at number 46 as one of the worst states to vote in.
Not a glorious position. No, not the worst.
Michael Palmonte is a co-author of the new book, The Cost of Voting Index in the American States. The book analyzes the systemic impact of election policies and explores why states make voting more difficult. And they found a pattern.
The difficulty of voting within a state is statistically linked to the percentage of the Republicans in the state legislature and the size or growth of the minority population.
Palmonte said because Texas doesn't have online or same-day voter registration and has a restricted mail-in voting system, the state falls short for ease of voting. I'm David Martin Davies in San Antonio.
There's no word yet on when the Texas Supreme Court will rule on a case involving a Dallas woman who's trying to get an abortion. A judge last week ruled that Kate Cox was eligible for an abortion because her fetus has a fatal condition that could also cause health problems for her. The Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton filed an appeal and sent a letter threatening to prosecute her doctor and any hospital that performs the procedure. The Texas Supreme Court issued a stay but has not indicated when the justices will hear the case. On Friday, a federal judge issued an order prohibiting the separation of families at the border for the purpose of deterring immigration for at least 8 years. Texas Public Radio's Jerry Clayton has more.
The order blocks resumption of a Trump-era policy. U.S. District Judge Dana Sabraw said the separations represented one of the most shameful chapters in the history of our country. Sabraw made the comments before approving a settlement between the U.S. Department of Justice and several families represented by the ACLU. That suit was filed 7 years ago. I'm Jerry Clayton in San Antonio.
An arrest has been made in the murder of a 16-year-old cheerleader in Jackson County. Police have a suspect in custody who matches the description of a man seen leaving the apartment complex following Lisbeth Medina's murder. Her mother discovered her body last week when she failed to show up to perform at a parade. I'm Matt Thomas from the Texas Newsroom.
You're listening to statewide news from public radio stations across Texas. This coverage is only possible because of support from listeners like you. You can help sustain and grow Texas news coverage by donating to your local public radio station today.
33 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard Time. I'm David Brown. Scientists and policymakers continue to sound the alarm about the risks posed by climate change. But do those alarm bells resonate with voters? Polls show that many young people take climate into account when they cast their ballots. And a new voter survey suggests they may be able to get something of a boost from a cohort of voters on the other end of the generational spectrum. Marianne Lavelle is a reporter for Inside Climate News. She wrote recently about a new voter survey that found a surprising number of voters 65 and older say issues related to climate change are important to them, too. Marianne, welcome to the Texas Standard.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with you.
Tell us about this voter survey. Who conducted it and what were they hoping to learn?
Yes, this was the Environmental Voter Project, and they are a Get Out the Vote group. They go around trying to identify environmental voters, climate voters, and get them to the polls. And in the course of doing that work, of course, they saw a lot of young people care about climate, but what they didn't expect is that they saw so many older voters, those 65 and older, who really put climate first when they go to the polls.
What about the survey itself? Was this a nationwide survey or certain locations involved or what?
What Environmental Voter Project does that's so interesting is they've identified about 18 states where environmental voters are big enough to make a difference. And so they looked at those 18 states, and it's a real cross-section of states. And what they found was just right across the board. Older voters were second to young people in their concern about climate change as a political issue.
I know a lot of listeners are going to be wondering, well, you mentioned 18 states part of this survey. Is Texas among them?
Texas is among them. And that means that there are enough climate voters in Texas to really make a difference if they get out there to vote.
And of course, as we all know, older voters are quite the force to be reckoned with, right?
Exactly. In the 2020 election, 76% of them went to vote. For young people, it was only about 50%. So one thing young people can learn from their older colleagues on the front lines is to get out there and vote. But older people have other advantages too, and that is networks of contacts they've built up over the years, and they have money. They have most of the financial assets in the United States, and they can put that to work for climate.
Very interesting. I wonder what it is. I know you spoke with leaders in climate activism. Did they give you a sense about what motivates older voters when it comes to climate?
Right. It's a little bit different than young people who are thinking about the future. For older people, they're thinking about legacy. And they're thinking about what they're leaving behind for their children and grandchildren.
I understand that there were some protests this spring. Older activists went after banks that provide funding for the fossil fuel industry. Can you say a little bit more about those protests?
Yes, in the spring, there were these protests in 100 different cities, and it really was kind of described as the first mass climate protests by older voters. They were organized by a group called Third Act, which was started by the activist Bill McKibben. He's so well known for his organizing of youth voters. But what he said is, youth voters, he totally believes it's important for the climate movement to organize them, but they don't have the structural power. They have intelligence and energy and idealism, but they don't have enough of the power by themselves to make the change needed in the very little time we have to act on climate.
I wonder if politicians have taken note of this finding, this idea that there could be a cross-generational coalition of environmental voters that could tip the balance in some places.
Well, one thing for sure is that if they aren't noticing it, it could be something they regret. There are enough older climate voters in a state like Arizona, for instance, which President Biden won by less than half of 1%. Well, there's 5% of voters in Arizona that are older climate voters, and they can really swing that election.
Marianne Lavelle is a Washington, D.C.-based reporter for Inside Climate News. We're going to have a link to her latest at texasstandard.org. Marianne, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Center for Proton Therapy, offering precision proton radiation treatment for many types of cancer. More at texasprotons.com.
It's the Texas Standard. I'm David Brown. Texas has the second largest Indian American population in the United States. And with that blend of culture in the melting pot of Texas cuisine, well, it can only amount to some truly exciting food. It's this reason Chef Deepa Sridhar has chosen to focus her new show on South Indian Texan cuisine. Its show, Can Deepa Texan, is available on YouTube, and she joins us now. Deepa, welcome to the Texas Standard.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
And congratulations on the new show. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I hear you grew up in Garland?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So I essentially immigrated with my family when I was 4 years old in the 90s and grew up in Garland, Texas. So really was a blend of being a South Indian, eating South Indian food at home, but also because we were immigrants in the 90s, there was a lot of just sort of crossover and cuisine immersion. And just generally speaking, the way I feel like a lot of South Indians in Texas cook is South Indian Texan food.
Well, you're going to have to say more about that, but I'm curious what sort of food you grew up eating. Some of those, that's just the ultimate comfort food for so many of us, the food we grew up on, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So we would, like I said, at home, a lot of times there were, in the beginning, I would say a lean towards traditional South Indian cuisine. I'm Tamilian, so it was sadams, which is like our version of courses, where you would have rasam, you would have different kinds of just basically a rice-based main part with a lot of pickles and sides to go with it. And then as we started to get more comfortable, not only just being in this country, but being in this subculture that is Texas, then you just really start to get more familiar with barbecue, with queso. Queso is huge, and you start to realize that there are actually some similarities of where you define fine dining in your own household and what you find outside.
So how do you incorporate that? Queso goes with anything. At least that's
queso
what
does.
I'll stick with that. But what other elements do you find yourself, or did your parents work into your meals, and that you find yourself using today?
Well, especially because I am a chef here in Austin, Texas. When I thought about, okay, I want to strike out on my own, I want to make food that is comforting to me It only made sense to go towards this route of South Indian Texan. And what that means is it does mean a lot of South Indian Mexican. It does mean South Indian Viet Cajun. It means basically finding those sort of crosshairs and seeing where kind of sort of the rubber meets the road with the cuisines that you find here in Texas and where I'm coming from.
Can I ask you about the title of your program, Candipa Texan? It sounds like it's a bit of a play on your name, but could you say more?
Yes, actually, it was my family that came up with it because there is a Tamilian word called kandipa. And kandipa, you use it sort of just to say, like, of course, like it's like a promise. Like if let's say like an auntie came up to me and was like, hey, are you coming to my house for this thing? If I say kandipa, that means like, oh, I'm there.
Yeah.
And now I cannot break that promise to that auntie. First of all, don't break promises to aunties in general.
No, never.
But it's so kandipa is just sort of used in that sort of vein. And then we just thought it could be funny because there's my name right there. And then if you don't know that Tamilian word and you're looking at it, it also does kind of look like Candipa Texan. So that's where it came from.
Love it. Now, for the show, you're focusing on South Indian Texan cuisine. What about a crash course in some of the flavor profiles or maybe a dish?
Yeah, absolutely. So that first dish that we feature on this show is a cast iron biryani. So a lot of it is also just the crosshairs. I keep using the word crosshairs. I'm going to find a new word, guys. I promise. But you find, it's on not only just the ingredients, but it is also the technique. Cast irons are, I feel, so important to a lot of just sort of heirloom Texan cuisine. And when you make a biryani, you don't necessarily bake it in the oven, and you don't necessarily make it into a cast iron situation. And so that was one element where we were able to sort of say, this is that Texan lean on something that really didn't have this. The cast iron is the ingredient.
What does the cast iron do? I mean, when I think of a biryani, I should say that I think of a dish with a lot of rice in it.
Absolutely. Oh, but the thing about a biryani is that you layer it in a certain way because you want first the meat on the bottom. It almost kind of feels like, counterintuitive because you're searing the meat, but that sear is not going to really show up in a traditional biryani because then you're layering it with rice, then you're covering it, and everything is getting poached in a vessel, essentially. What we're doing here is we're searing that meat, and because it's in a cast iron is an oven in itself. And it's keeping that heat. And when we're adding that rice and those layers to it, what you're getting is a really nice, beautiful, crispy edge that you wouldn't necessarily have in a traditional biryani. When you put that whole cast iron in an oven covered, it's getting poached within, but it's also getting a sear at the same time. And you have something that's completely different, a new element.
Oh, I love it. I mean, just you talking about it makes me really want to try it. So if someone listening wants to try their hand at cooking something in the South Indian Texas genre, if we can call it that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's always tricky to sort of put things in a box, but if you were advising them, where would you start? What's a basic foundation for folks to know? Is there a dish or something that you would recommend?
So I don't know if I would recommend a dish. Again, this definitely watch the series because I feel like it sort of gives you sort of an idea of how South Indian Texan cuisine comes to be. Yep. I think more so, and I think I would say this about any cuisine because I do find that people find the names of cuisine more intimidating than actually once you get into it. And I think a lot of fusion cuisine, something that I'm very passionate about just because that is who I am, has to do with intuition. So let's say like if your family makes an incredible like mac and cheese dish, a way for you to incorporate different flavors is going to that particular sort of culture store. Like for instance, we have all over the country, we call them desi food stores or Indian stores. And basically they are your local neighborhood just mom and pop desi food stores, and they're just a great way to start exploring. I would say just be unafraid, unabashed. learn where you can, read where you can, watch the series, of course, but really sort of don't be afraid to make things happen that feel scary.
Yeah.
I love when people just decide, like, I'm just going to try something and just let it fly. I think recipes are more about, like, you know, here's a suggestion, and obviously food safety matters. Follow those things. But other than that, don't be afraid. You know, it's the most human thing to do is to cook. So we should all do more cooking.
I love it. Oh, my goodness. I can't wait to check out your new program. It's called Can Deepa Texan, and we've been speaking with Chef Deepa Sridhar. She grew up in the Garland, Texas area, and now she is worldwide with her new YouTube program. We're going to have links to more at texasstandard.org. Deepa, congratulations, and thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us on the Texas Standard.
Thank you so much, David. It was an honor.
Support for Texas Standard comes from Texas Oncology, allowing patients to be actively involved in their health care by providing access to clinical trials in pursuit of new treatments and advances in medical care. More at texasoncology.com.
This is the Texas Standard. I'm Laura Rice. Childcare is among the largest expenses for working families, including those in the armed services. But thousands of military parents are on wait lists, unable to enroll their kids in base childcare centers. The problem is both a lack of staff and a shortage of childcare facilities. While the Pentagon has made some progress addressing the issues, families might still wait years for a childcare opening. Andrew Dyer reports for the American Homefront Project.
Are you ready for your nap?
It's almost nap time at the Navy's Child Development Center on Marine Corps Air Station Miramar in San Diego, and the toddlers in this class are just finishing some snacks before lying down.
Come on.
This brand new center opened in October. It's high-tech and secure. A wall of monitors in the lobby shows live video from each of the classrooms. Parents can drop in any time and see their children, and front desk staff can see what's happening at all times. All its classrooms open to outdoor, age-appropriate playgrounds. Most are empty now, but Janet Hooten, who manages child and youth programs for the Navy throughout the Southwest, says once the center is fully staffed, there will be room for more than 300 children, space that's desperately needed.
We're excited about that because our wait list is about 500 children for just Miramar. But Metro San Diego, we have about 2,600 children on the wait list, and about 1,100 of those are under the age of 12 months.
Those numbers are significantly better than they were during the summer of 2022, when more than 4,000 military kids were on the San Diego wait list. They're just part of the more than 8,500 military children worldwide the Pentagon says are waiting now. Another 2,000 non-military children are also waiting to be placed in Defense Department child care centers. Francisco Jameson is the Chief of Military Programs and Strategy at Child Care Aware of America, the nonprofit that helps manage the Pentagon's fee assistance subsidy for military families. He says child care challenges are especially difficult for those families.
There's servicemen and women who put their lives on the line every day to protect our freedoms. But they're also those same family members who are most likely not living anywhere near their family support. And that lack of family support is why I think it's so important for non-military folks to understand that that's why the military needs to be taken care of especially.
He says long wait lists are just a symptom of a larger problem nationwide.
10 years ago, the wait list was the biggest challenge, in my opinion. It has gone down, in my opinion, to third place. Having enough staff, having enough centers are way more important now because the wait list would be improved if we could fix that.
Sarah Jacobs, a California Democrat, sits on the House Armed Services Committee. Miramar is part of her district, as are thousands of service members living in central and eastern San Diego County. She says taking care of military families at home should be a top Pentagon priority.
The number one thing that I hear from military families in my town halls with them and conversation is really about quality of life issues, predominantly housing and childcare.
Jacobs points to several amendments in next year's defense bill she says will address childcare, including better pay and benefits for workers and a boost in the childcare subsidy service members receive.
And then also on the family side, increasing transparency and accuracy of the wait lists so that they understand, how long they'd have to wait.
The new Miramar Center is the first of 3 facility projects in San Diego. Another center at Miramar is being updated, and the Navy's building another brand new center at Naval Base Point Loma. In addition to building new centers, Hooten says better pay and bonuses are helping. A partnership with local colleges is also promising.
We are in the process of working with our colleges that have the early childhood departments, and so looking at internship and bringing them on board as well.
Jameson says it's important for military families to get on the wait list as soon as they learn they're expecting a child. Don't wait until the baby's born. Reporting from San Diego, I'm Andrew Dyer.
This story was produced by the American Homefront Project, a public media collaboration that reports on American military life and veterans. And you're listening to the Texas Standard. And it is time again to check in with the Standard's Wells Dunbar, who's been keeping an eye on breaking news and your conversation online. Wells, welcome back.
Hi, Laura. It is that time. Where does the time go, I wonder?
So fast.
Well, it flies when you're hearing from as many people as we are about the topics we've been exploring today, including the one I was talking about earlier, those latest developments. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton threatening the doctors and hospitals involved with the potential abortion a Dallas woman is seeking after she was granted that permission by a court, but then the Texas Supreme Court put a stay on that ruling, the patient seeking the abortion due to the non-viability of the fetus and potential health risks it poses. Jed Billings on our Facebook page says, I remember when Republicans demanded we keep government out of health care because it was between a person and their doctor. Now Ken Paxton is threatening to sue everyone involved because a judge said a woman could have an abortion to protect her life and the fetus wasn't going to survive. It's kind of like how Greg Abbott said parents know what's best for their child, except when the parents try to do what is best for their children, and he threatens them with investigations and prosecutions. I think our listener there referring there to some of the instances we've seen with parents of transgender teen Texans in the state there, and some, as we've reported, investigations into those families. So lots of folks concerned about that out there. A more local story here being highlighted by one of our regular listeners, Gabrielle Gordon. She writes on her Facebook page that I heard Keller ISD is voting this afternoon on whether to allow chaplains to be school counselors. She says, I can't go to the meeting, but will they have enough of these new counselor types to cover all of the different religions and subsets, she asks. There's more than one type of evangelical Christian, more than one type of Lutheran, etc. And another listener chimes in to note that that term chaplains can be misleading as there is no certification or licensing required. This law, in their words, is designed to push religion into schools. So, yeah, interesting seeing that borne out by some local reporting there in North Texas. Situation there to keep an eye on in Keller ISD on whether or not they, allow that one to go forward. Another story we've been reporting on here kind of ties back to the other story about the instances of school funding and the difficulties that many schools have that we heard there earlier in that great series we've been sharing installments of, Laura.
Yeah, so this issue with chaplains, this was, I believe, just this last legislative session, right? So this isn't something that Keller ISD just made up all on their own.
But
they are following up on it.
Yes.
Yeah. So it could be a thing that we do see at other districts. So interesting, though, that that we're watching that happen in Keller. And our listener brought up a really good point. I think the concerns that that some who spoke against that bill when it was making its way through the legislature. I was going to say this past legislative session, but I realized as I'm saying that there's been like 5 of them since the regular session.
I had to stop and check myself for a minute and say, are we still in one right now? But no, unfortunately so. I believe we are not, and that 4th, special legislative session has expired. Well, real quickly, I'll just chime in to say that Jay Knowles on our Facebook page is excited about the Cowboys wiping out Philadelphia. So that was a one to watch yesterday.
All right. Wells Dunbar is watching, and he's watching what you've got to say online. Thank you so much, Wells. And I'd like to send one more big thank you to the Texas Standard's fall interns who are just wrapping up their last days with us. Allison Rodriguez, Breezy Reyes, and Edley Termillion. Wonderful folks. Thank you so much for listening.
Philanthropic support for Texas Standard comes from Casey and Scott O'Hare, the Winkler Family Foundation, Lynn Dobson and Greg Wooldridge, Adrian Killam, and the George Huntington family.
If you want to know what's going on in the world, then you need to know what's going on in Texas. Every weekday on the Texas Standard, we bring you stories from across the state that affect what's going on elsewhere. As part of the NPR network, an independent coalition of public media podcasters, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Michael Marks. Talk to you tomorrow.
You ever been there when an uncomfortable question about race comes up, but you don't know how to answer? That's where Code Switch lives. Each week, we're talking about race and how it intersects with every other aspect of your life, from politics and pop culture to history and food. Listen now to the Code Switch podcast from NPR.